All right, welcome Faith Church to this week's Theology Thursday. As you guys know, we just finished the series on the Gospel of John, and as we normally do, we like to get questions and answers submitted from you guys about different questions you might have from the series, from the book. Normally we do that live in the service, but we have not had a live service in a while, but we still wanted to hear you guys' questions, and I'll be honest, I was super excited when I saw the questions, because sometimes it's just kind of let's play the game of try to stump the pastor. And this time I feel like we really got some really good questions. So I'm excited to get into those and ask you those, Pastor Mike. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. The first question we got for the book of John was, why wasn't Jesus more direct about how we become one of his followers? He seemed opaque about his death and resurrection. It seems the disciples were often confused, and I'm wondering why he didn't get to the point, here's how you become a follower of mine. What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, first of all, this is fun. This is fun to do this, and hopefully it's helpful and beneficial to you. And it's not hard to stump this pastor. Other pastors, maybe it's a little harder to do. So I'm glad we're not playing that game, because that wouldn't be a whole lot of fun. But yeah, interesting question. So I love the word choice there, opaque. Around Jesus and maybe some of the directness of what it is to follow him. I actually don't think Jesus was opaque. I actually think he was pretty transparent. In fact, I think he was really transparent about what it looks like. But I can understand the question, because what you see in John's gospel is throughout the religious leaders, I don't think they're confused. I just don't think they really want to follow Jesus. But the disciples seem to have a sincere desire of following him. And it doesn't seem like they totally get it. And so I think there's probably two sides of this. At one level, I think that when you look at Jesus, and of course the Old Testament is such a crucial element for understanding Jesus, I think what they had kind of created in their mind, and maybe their interpretation of what the Messiah was going to look like, that even though he was checking boxes in certain texts, we're like, well, okay, yeah, we know he's from Bethlehem, and we know some of these other things that are true of him, but he just didn't fit the regal, royal, kick the Romans out of Jerusalem mold. So I think that was part of it. And I do think one of the things about this question that I think is maybe, hey, here's how you become a follower of mine, almost in a methodical or a step-by-step process. At one level, you have that in the Old Testament. And I want to be careful in saying that, because I don't think it was really that. Certainly God's intent was never, hey, if you check the boxes, then we're good. God has always, always, always been about capturing the heart of his people and personal relationship with his people. But I think you actually have some of that in the Old Testament. And that was a disaster for Israel. They failed miserably in that. And so I think part of what Jesus is doing is he's inviting people to follow him because they love him. And they love him more than anyone else. And so I think that's probably part of what's going on. I think some of the disciples' confusion is what they anticipated from the Messiah, which isn't what they're gathering from the scriptures. I think it's just kind of some of the social interpretation and some of the traditions around, hey, here's what we think he's going to be like. That created more confusion than clarity. But what we know is by the end, right? You read the book of Acts, they're convinced. They've got it figured out. And they've got it put together. And so I think the same is true for us. There just comes a point in time where we love Jesus, we choose to follow Jesus, and so that's the one that we're pursuing. But yeah, good question.
And there certainly seems to be like an unfolding nature, too, as their time is spent with him, which there was certainly a lot to process. So it's not surprising they didn't drop it all on him all at once.
Right, and even for us, we have the benefit of reading all of the Bible, for that matter. Yeah. From a perspective with hindsight, right? The Romans didn't exist when John 6 was unfolding, or some of those things. I mean, and so there is a different element for sure.
All right, let's keep rolling. So the second question: why does Jesus say that he is God and that they are one? But in Genesis 1, it says, "Let us." It sounds like two people. Jesus says he will sit at the right hand of the Father, as he is the second person. Can you help me understand this?
Yes. Well, first of all, if I could write with clarity and simplicity on the Trinity, I'd write a book and be a millionaire. This is just a hard for us in our finite mind to fully grasp the totality of this. So interestingly enough, you actually rightly identified that they are two people. And there's a third person we would want to make sure that we include in the conversation, the Holy Spirit. And so the let us from Genesis 1, now there's some different interpretations on that. Some people, and I personally hold to, I think that's the Trinity. I think the Trinity is having a conversation, and by God's grace, he lets us in on that conversation. I think not Romans 6, Isaiah 6 is another place where the Trinity is having a conversation, and Isaiah is privy to part of that conversation. Other people might say that Jesus is talking to the divine council or angels, or sorry, God is in Genesis 1. I personally believe he's talking to the Trinity there. And so I think the question is, how do we understand the unity of the person of God when there's also three persons of God? And that's the million-dollar question, because it's hard for us in our mind where we want to run to one end or the other. One does not equal three. And so we're confused by that, and yet that's part of the mystery of the Trinity. They are one. Father, Son, and Spirit are one in every sense that you can possibly imagine, and yet they are three distinct persons. And so the let us is just that. I think it's the Trinity having the conversation. The right hand of the Father, it's because they're distinct. There's three distinct persons, but it is one person, right? We serve one God who also is distinct in three persons of Father, Son, and Spirit. And like I said, if I could write with clarity on this, I'd have already wrote a book and I'd be a millionaire. And that's just part of the mystery on this, is how does one equal three? And maybe in eternity we'll figure it out, or maybe 10,000 years from now we'll still be marveling like, man, how does God do that? Right. But right now we just we can't totally put it together.
I don't think we want a God we can fully comprehend.
I don't.
Right.
That's a pretty small God.
Yeah, exactly. All right, still rolling through. In John 14, you talked about all three entities of the triune being equal, but in John 14:28, Jesus says the Father is greater than him. Does that mean he's greater while he's a person, or something different? So a different aspect of that Trinity question.
Yeah, similar concept with the Trinity, but a different piece. So I'm looking at John 14 here. Let me just say one thing here. Not trying to pick on anyone, but I would say all three persons of the triune being equal, right? Each member of the Trinity is a person, a being. They're not an impersonal force. They're I don't want to necessarily say a human, right? A person, a being that is true of each member of the Trinity. So I'm looking at John 14 here. And so verse 28, here's what Jesus says. And of course, this is part of the upper room discourse. Verse 28 says, "You heard me say to you," Jesus to the disciples, "I'm going away and I'll come to you. If you loved me, you would have rejoiced, because I'm going to the Father, for the Father is greater than I." Probably two things come to my mind when I think about this. One is there's plenty of ancient heresies around people trying to wrap their mind around Jesus and him somehow being less than God. So what we don't want to do in any way, shape, or form is imply that God is somehow superior or of greater value, or only God is fully God. And again, a lot of ancient heresies around that Jesus was created, or he's only partially God, or he kind of morphed into becoming God. From eternity past, Jesus has been fully God. So to be fair, that's just clear on that. So then the question is, why would he say that the Father is greater than I? And I think contextually you could probably argue some things on this. Remember, Jesus is talking about leaving. And so, which is new for the disciples. They're like, wait, what do you mean you're leaving? And so part of what he's getting at, even in the first half, he's like, hey, I'm going. If you love me, you would have rejoiced. For the Father is greater than I. I think partly what Jesus is getting at is, hey guys, I'm leaving, and you shouldn't be grieved, because where I'm going is better than where I'm at. I get to go back to where I came from, and I get to go back to the presence of the Father. It might even be an implication of the will of the Father over the will of the disciples being in view, that while the disciples would have wanted Jesus to stay, no doubt, I mean, who wouldn't want Jesus to stay, that maybe that's part of what's in view there. What is not in view is some sense of inferiority. In no way, shape, or form is Jesus inferior. And so that's what we would want to be clear on. What exactly is greater? It could be returning to the Father's presence, could be the will of the Father, could be a couple of things. But what we know for sure is it's not the inferiority of Jesus.
Oh, that's good. So next question, keep rolling. Why does John's gospel seem so different from the other gospels? There's lots of stories that are only in John and others in the three gospels that aren't in John. Why is that?
Well, good question. And
Yeah.
yes, you're right. It is different. So when you think of the four gospels, often Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as the synoptics. And there's a lot of similarity, a lot of continuity even, that are tied to them. A lot of people think that depending on where they land on the order of when they're written, that those guys used each other's work as they composed their own gospel. And you have to remember, John was the last gospel written. It was the latest gospel written. It was quite a number of years. We're talking decades and decades after Jesus lived that John was written. One of the things actually that I was struck by last week in preparing was there's no parables in John. And it didn't even really dawn on me. I mean, now Jesus will speak in some artistic ways, but you read through Matthew, Mark, or Luke, and there's just plenty of those, and you're like, wait, there's no parables here. So you're right that they're different. Why do some of the stories show up in John that don't show up in the synoptics? It could be that at that point, John is wanting to write to include some other things that haven't come out. It could be what we know of all the Gospels. Every author has a very specific intent. We talk about authorial intent. There's a specific emphasis that they want to highlight. And so John has a very different feel because John, as he tells us at the end in chapter 20, these things are written so that you may believe in Jesus and knowing that he's the Christ, or believe in his name and believing in him have eternal life. And so certainly that's John's emphasis. Not that Matthew, Mark, or Luke didn't want people to believe in Jesus, but they had different audiences in mind, right? Matthew's writing to Jews, Luke's writing to Gentiles, and so that certainly colors and influences why they include or why they order things the way that they order them. Ultimately, why is John different? Because by the inspiration of the Spirit, God moved in a way that John would be different to include some different things. The specific answer to that, we can grab John in eternity and maybe ask him, or maybe better yet, we just ask the Lord, hey, why this distinction from these others? But you're right in identifying, because it's markedly different from the other three Gospels. And it really is surprising how many things are in John that aren't in the other Gospels, and vice versa.
I do think of, don't know the exact verbiage he uses, but at the end of the book, like, no book could possibly contain all the works that Christ did. So obviously there's going to be distinction, even just in how do you capture a life like Christ in a single life,
good luck.
You know?
And even one of the things that Kara and I, my daughter, were talking about the other day about John was, one of the things that's shocking is in all the Gospels, you have, I mean, we're talking a handful of sentences that comprise the first 30 years of Jesus' life. And then you get a lot on the last 3 years. But even John's Gospel, chapters 1 through 12, deal with Jesus' ministry. And then really almost the second half of the book deals with a matter of a few days. I mean, a week, really, with him being in the upper room, his death, burial, and resurrection, and then him appearing to different groups. So even that, just a huge emphasis on the end of Jesus' life.
Right. So this, I think, is a great question. I'm excited to hear how you answer this one. It says, you talked often about the Old Testament in John. I don't naturally see the Old Testament coming out as I read a gospel. Should I? And how would I get better at seeing that? This is kind of one of my hobby horses. I think it's huge. So I'm excited to hear how you'll answer this.
That's a great question. I love this question. So whoever wrote this, thank you. Really, really good question. And I think a couple things come to my mind. So I don't naturally see the Old Testament in John. I'll own my own kind of upbringing and bias that I grew up like that too. And by God's grace, I've moved away from that. And so if you're like, hey, I don't naturally see it, don't be embarrassed or ashamed of that. I struggled with that for a long, long time. Probably the most impactful statement for me was years ago, someone's asking, what's the context for the Gospels? And you just kind of sit there and you're like, what is the context? And the context is the Old Testament. So in all the ways that we talk so often about context being so important for biblical understanding, when you realize the context that gives insight, the key, if you think of like a map and they have like the key to help you understand the map, the Old Testament is that for the Gospels. And so maybe more so than other books or other Gospels, John leans more into this in some ways, particularly around some of the feasts, the whole I am dynamic that Jesus does. And I'm not saying the other Gospels don't have lots of Gospel or Old Testament context, they do. But maybe John leans into it in a different way. And so if we don't naturally see it, then the solution to that, I think, is twofold. One is to begin to rewire ourselves to go, the Old Testament is the context by which I want to view the Gospels through. And so we start to think through it that way. And then secondly, how do I start to see it? Well, you got to read the Old Testament. You got to be familiar with the Old Testament. I get it. In my Bible, the Old Testament's 800 pages. And so that's a lot of material. But I think if you just commit yourself, on an annual basis, I want to get through the Old Testament once, or I'm going to focus on different parts of the Old Testament. And so at this point in my life, I couldn't tell you how many times I've read the Old Testament, certainly north of 20, 30 times at this point in time. And I'll admit there's often times that I don't see the Old Testament right away. Sometimes things will come to me in commentaries. Sometimes it comes up in our pastor's meeting, things of that nature. But I think reading, rereading, just saturating yourself in that. And that's even one of the reasons that we preach a lot from the Old Testament. I think the average Christian today is far more comfortable going to Romans or Ephesians or even one of the Gospels and deriving what God has for them in that than they are going to Micah, which is where we're going to be this Sunday or starting this Sunday. So I think that's a huge part of it. Should I see the Old Testament? Yes. How do I get better at seeing that? Some of it is just practice and trying to, hey, what might this mean? Or I want to look at stuff. And then some of it is you just got to read more and more of the Old Testament. And the beauty of the Old Testament, right? I know you would say this. The beauty of the Old Testament is as you read it more and more, what you actually see is how it points us forward to Christ. So the Gospels do a great job of connecting. But as you get into the Old Testament more and more, you're like, it's like this whole book was about Jesus,
right?
Which it is, right? So from Genesis to Revelation, it's all pointing us to Jesus.
Are there any books outside of the Bible that might help someone kind of read the Bible with the cross in view, or how those things point towards that?
Yeah, I'm going to do something. I'm going to go grab a couple books because I just want people to see this. That's a good follow-up question. But there's a couple I keep on my desk here. Here's one. Where's the other one?
You can tell how scripted this is. And how we planned
Right,
perfectly beforehand.
Oh man, I'll use this one too. This one most people want. There were three books that came to my mind. I can't find the third one, and this is going to sound bad because I normally keep stuff on my desk that I reference often.
Yeah. I was thinking Graham Goldsworthy.
Yeah,
that's
so
what I had in mind.
This one here, this is for theological nerds. I mean, the thing is huge, okay? But this is the commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament by G.K. Beale and D.A. Carson. And so listen, this is this basically walks you through any text in the New Testament and helps you make connection to the Old Testament, context, history, things of that nature. So this is a little more nerdy. This is stuff you and I like. Other people might be like.
Anyone leading a Bible study on any sort of regularity, though, that's a great book.
Great resource. And then this is probably Reading the Bible for All It's Worth. Yeah. And I'm spacing on who wrote that. But that's just a really helpful one, very simple. And then Graham Goldsworthy, this is the Goldsworthy trilogy. So each of these are books you can buy separate. I just bought them together. Gospel and Kingdom, Gospel and Wisdom, and Gospel and Revelation. This is probably the single best book that I would recommend. And it's a really easy read. I mean, it's not complicated, but it's really helpful in putting together what the emphasis of the Old Testament is in pointing us forward to who Christ, or what Christ would do, and how Christ fulfills everything that's going on in the Old Testament. Yeah, good. This is a great question.
Right.
Great question.
Also, read the book of Hebrews. That's a great way in the New Testament connecting to all kinds of imagery in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's good.
Final question to kind of wrap us up here. I'm curious for you personally, what were you most impacted by in John? I'm curious to think, because obviously this is one that you would have cherished before you started the series, but what, maybe even as you preached through it.
Yeah, so one of the things, when you preach a sermon series, as whoever's running that series, you've spent weeks, if not months, in that book before you ever preach. So we'll start Micah this Sunday. I started reading Micah regularly in January. So I'm kind of up to my eyeballs in Micah, even though we're just kicking it off. So for John, man, I probably started reading John in earnest about this time last year. And so that, yeah, this is an interesting question. I wish I would have thought of this or had this in view maybe a year ago when I started. I think for me, and it's funny, we actually talked about this as a family Sunday afternoon. We were having some conversation on this. I think probably a couple things come out. One actually kind of tied to the question about the Old Testament was the number of rich allusions that Jesus makes. And so some of these were new for me. Up until this series, the finger of God in John 8 and how I think John's actually connecting that to the Ten Commandments. I'd never seen that before. That was new to me. Jesus and his resurrection and John being real intentional about the angels at his head and his feet and the mercy seat. I mean, that's still blowing my mind as I think about that. So I think a lot of the ways that God was foreshadowing and giving pointers and helping his people to see this is the Christ. And even going back to that question, I feel like it's opaque. And the more and more we see the Old Testament, it's like, oh no, it's pretty clear. And then I think the ways in which Jesus pursued people. And what I mean by that, certainly some of this, because it was more recent in my mind, is Peter. The restorative work of Peter. But I think one of the most impactful parts of the entire series of John was John 9 and the blind man. And so here's this guy who Jesus heals miraculously. The religious leaders are just jerks. I mean, they're just jerks to this guy. And so they keep wanting him to say something other than Jesus healed me. He won't say it. And then he gets kicked out of the temple. And so you have to understand, up until that point, because he's blind, he could have never gone into the temple to worship. Finally given the opportunity to worship. Now it's taken away from him. And I think it's verse 34, verse 35, I can't remember exactly which one. But Jesus goes and seeks him out. And so much of John's gospel, you see Jesus both in a spiritual sense, teasing out of people the deeper issues. He does that with the Samaritan woman, with Nicodemus, obviously the blind man, Peter, so many times. But the initiating work of Jesus, that just from start to finish, even his incarnation, right, is him initiating to us. So I think that for me, and realizing he's doing that in my life, and he's doing that in your life, he's doing that in your life, that has just been so profound for me in reflecting on that. So I could probably talk for hours about this, but I won't.
Yeah, well, I hope you guys were encouraged and helped by this. I know I've loved this series in John, and similar to what you're saying, all these things and all these stories, that's the same God who loves us and saved us.
Amen.
And it's been great to meditate on that. So we're looking forward to Micah, and I hope you'll have questions for that as well.
So let's hope.
Yeah.
Thanks.